Headwind and a Strachey here. Yeah, the Melvins. I feel like a lot of people know their name. I don't know too many people that actually are huge Melvin fans. I hear a lot of people say that they like the Melvins, like they like the idea of the Melvins, but really I'm like one of the few people I know that like has all their albums, sees them live, whenever they play. And, I'm a huge fan. Melvins are one of my favorite bands in the kind of late zeros. I got into the Melvins after, again, knowing of them, but never really diving into their discography. And it's with a certain album that I started with them, which we'll get to, and I'll explain that when we get there. But rather than doing a, straightforward discography review or a rankorama, I want to keep this a little shorter. I know if the video's too long, I'm not going to get too many views. And I'm trying to convince you to listen to this shit. So I'm going to try to make it as snappy as possible, all right? I'm trying to help you listen to awesome music like the Melvins right here. One of the greatest bands ever, one of the most influential bands ever. If you don't know, they were a major influence on grunge. Some of you headbangers, that's not a good thing because you hate a lot of grunge. But let me tell you something. The kind of grunge the Melvins did, man, not like the kind of grunge that became popular in the 90s on MTV. If you love Black Sabbath, if you love doom metal, if you love early 80s thrash and the new wave of British heavy metal, if you like raw, kind of down and dirty, gritty heavy metal music, well, then you should definitely be getting into some Melvins. The thing with the Melvins, though, and yeah, there's a thing, is they've been around for a while and they're a very prolific band. They sometimes have 2 albums a year. So there's a lot of material. Plus, the Melvins have a experimental side. And they have a few albums that are full-fledged experimental noise records. And if that's the first Melvins album you got, you'd be like, oh, what's this pretentious shit? And you'd not want to listen to any of their albums. But the thing is, their accessibility varies depending on the album and period you hit them. Even though they have this experimental side, they're, especially in more recent years, I would say for the past 15 something years, they've gotten very accessible actually. And you hear a lot of Buzz Osborne's, his classic rock and more traditional heavy metal influence especially emerging in the mid to late O's. Although that influence was always there and fairly early on. Buzz Osborne was a huge Kiss fan. So a huge Kiss fan, especially the early stuff. And they covered Going Blind. He loved Kiss, and he was a big Kiss fan, and he, unlike a lot of these grunge guys in the 90s, he wore his heavy metal fandom proudly on his arm. Unleashed in the East is an album he often talks up still to this day, and says it's the greatest heavy metal album ever recorded. And guess what? I agree with him. Buzz is also a huge Rolling Stones fan and Beatles fan. Very big Beatles fan. In fact, the Melvins have covered the Beatles multiple times, and also Paul McCartney. But he also has this side that loves a lot of punk rock, loved early Black Flag, and a lot of experimental stuff. He's just an eclectic music lover. People that like that tend to make the best music. Just something I noticed. People that get all locked into a scene, their music's like in a box. But people that are more open-minded, even if they do just one kind of music, there's more nuance and character to that kind of music when they have eclectic taste. But Buzz Osborne, who's the guitarist of the band, the main songwriter of the band, he has amazing music taste. It's actually, similar to my taste, so that's why I like it. He's amazing. His guitar playing is sludgy and thick, and you hear a lot of Sabbath influence, but he doesn't do the predictable doom metal thing. And I like a lot of doom metal, but doom metal pretty much follows the blueprint of Sabbath, whereas Buzz, he mixes in all these other influences. He mixes in a little Zuma era Neil Young, and he mixes in some Black Flag, and he mixes in a little early Slayer. I hear a little bit of that in it, and even a touch of psychedelic Beatles and Stones. You just hear this all kind of mixed up in the music to create a very distinctly Melvin sound. And again, early Kiss, very big influence, especially those first 3 Kiss albums. You hear a lot of that in his music. And his singing style, Buzz Osborne, he's also the singer of the band, his biggest influence vocally is clearly Gene Simmons. We're talking Demon Gene. So if you love Gene Simmons' voice, as I do, if you love Demon Gene, how can you not love the Melvins? Because it's like Demon Gene is singing every song, except for it's Demon Buzz. I love his singing. It's very over the top, and just such a great sound, man. Such a great sound. That's the thing. Half of it is the sound. Once you love the Melvins sound, that's it. But on top of that, Buzz is a really great songwriter. And it's not like obvious, like, sometimes there's some bands like AC/DC or Black Sabbath where the hooks and the melodies are really obvious. But then there are some bands, like I would say, like Motorhead, like people hear them and it just sounds kind of like they focus on the heaviness and the speed and Lemmy's voice. But if you can get past that, you'll start noticing that Lemmy's a crackerjack songwriter. Like he writes really catchy songs, And once you get used to hearing something that heavy that's also catchy, you can kind of start hearing the catchiness of it. Another band I think has hooks and melodies, but to some people, they're just noise, is Sonic Youth. I think Sonic Youth has great hooks and melodies. They're not traditional hooks and melodies, but they're there, and the deeper you get into their music, you could kind of hear, and some albums more so than others, but they definitely do have hooks. They're just kind of Sonic Youth hooks. And the Melvins, depending on the album, some albums are more obviously hook-driven than others. There's a few just full-fledged experimental albums they have. For the most part, even their earlier, rawer, heavier stuff, I always hear hooks and melodies, man. I hear hooks and melodies in the Melvins. Buzz just keeps knocking them out, and they've only gotten more accessible as the years have gone by. So let's get into this, but this is the thing. I'm going to explain how I think you should get into the discography. You should just start from the beginning. You're going to hit some funky stuff you might not be into. And I want you to love the Melvins. So this is going to be my recommendations on how you should listen to the Melvins. All right, especially if you're like a hard rock, heavy metal fan, this is how I think you should start. And a credit to the Melvins, that they're a band that's still out there, kind of like Motorhead was, like Overkill, my favorite thrash band. They're a band that just is constantly working. They're constantly putting out albums, they're constantly touring, and bands like that tend to stay good. That's the thing. The Melvins never really got bad. There's a few albums that I think are so-so, but I always had respect for whatever they did. And more often than not, their albums are good or great. There's a consistency to the band. They don't jump on every new trend. They stay current and timeless at the same time. Amazing. They're an amazing band. And really, I say band, but essentially it's two guys. It's Buzz Osborne and the drummer, Dale Crover. Dale Crover's been with Buzz since the beginning. He's the only constant member of the band. An amazing drummer. A big sound. I love his drumming. Essentially, the sound of Buzz's fuzzy, sludgy electric guitar and demon vocals with Dale's over-the-top, big beat fucking drums. That's the Melvin sound. The bassists have changed over the years. What drummers were for Spinal Tap, Melvins are with bassists. So let's just get into it. All right. So this is where I think you should begin. I think you should actually begin in 2006. That's right. I think the album A Senile Animal is where most people should begin with the Melvins. I think it's their most accessible album. Wow. This is their third decade into the band's career, and they released their most accessible, hook-driven, melodic album, but still ballsy and heavy as fuck. If you love Black Sabbath, if you love Metallica, if you love Kiss, if you love Judas Priest, and if you like some grunge like Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Nirvana, if you like all that stuff, or at least some of that stuff, there's no reason for you not to like this. Every track's great. It goes from melodic kind of trippy stoner rock to full-fledged kind of on the border of thrash heavy metal. It's fucking awesome, this album. This album also has two drummers. This was a period where they enlisted the drummer and bassist from a band called Big Business, Jarrett Warren on bass, and Cody Willis on drums. So they have two drummers. And the funny thing is, Dale was already such a big sounding drummer. There's a lot going on with Dale's drumming. And now you got two drummers, two big sounding drummers. And somehow it works though. You don't even think of it. They kind of sync up and just sound like one massive drummer. It's amazing drumming. Actually the two of them combined, it sounds kind of like one John Bonham, because no one ever sounded bigger than John Bonham. But these two drummers together, they do. They match John Bonham. And man, I love the drum sound. I love the production. I would say this is their best lineup. The two Melvins and the two Big Business guys coming together, there was something really magical about it. They only did 3 albums and 1 EP, but those 3 albums, I think are the albums you should start with. You should start with first Senile Animal, and then after that was 2008's Nude with Boots, which might be even better. I don't know. I bounce between these two albums, and they're both either like my third or fourth favorite Melvins album. They're amazing. Either one would be a great album to start with. Buy both of them. They're that good. And Nude with Boots, if anything, is even more accessible. Brings in a little more of a Zeppelin-esque quality at times, but yet still gets very heavy. And man, it's just all the music I love. It's this great classic rock, heavy metal, hard rock, all just mixed in this fucking tasty, badass stew. It sounds amazing. And the third album that they did, it's kind of like a trilogy of the big business guys, is 2010's The Bride Screamed Murder. The Bride Screamed Murder. Badass album title, badass album cover, badass album. I love it. Definitely start with the Senile Animal and Nude of Boots first. The Bride Screamed Murder is not as accessible as the first two, but it's still fairly accessible, especially it's a little leans into the Sabbath influence a little more. It's a little doomier. It's a little darker. It gets a little weirder towards the end, a little touch of psychedelia. But man, if you like the other two albums, you'll like this one too. It's the same lineup. It's a great album. So yeah, I'd get a Senile Animal, Nude of Boots, and then The Bride Screamed Murder. Great introduction to this band. After these three albums, I would actually jump to the 90s, to probably, I would say, their two most well-known albums in their career. I'd go to 1993's Houdini. Now, this was their major label debut. They were on a major label for a couple of years there, and Kurt Cobain was involved in the production. It's one of their most, I guess you could say, commercially produced albums. But still, it's not like a sellout album, but it is a little more hook driven and a little more melodic than what they were doing previously. But man, it is heavy. You hear it right out of the gate. Those drums, the guitar, fucking buzzes, screaming, fucking demon voice. It's so heavy, but with a groove, man, a groove. And this is the album that has the cover, a great cover of Going Blind, one of my favorite Kiss songs. And there's some experimental stuff towards the end, but for the most part, this is good, catchy. You could call it grunge. They started grunge, so they do it better than anyone else. There's also elements of traditional heavy metal mixed into this, and a few songs are even a little border thrash and a little stoner metal, kind of all mixed together. It's an amazing album. But what's even better is the album that came out the following year, 1994, Stoner Witch. I love Stoner Witch. It's my second favorite Melvins album. So definitely check this album out. Get Houdini and Stoner Witch. They're a great 1-2 punch. Stoner Witch, I think the songs are even stronger, and it brings in a little more of a stoner metal element. It's a little more Sabbathy. There's even a little bit of a Metallica quality. And then the last half of the album, it gets more experimental. And towards the end, there are like actual like full-fledged ambient tracks. They're just like ambient noise, and that's where I'm always more open-minded to more experimental stuff. By doing it this way, it's like you can listen to this album when all like the more heavy metal and more accessible songs are, and then kind of stop, or you can keep on listening if you want to hear some cool kind of trippy atmospheric shit at the end. And this album definitely just gets better and better every time you listen to it. One of the greatest albums of the 90s. I love Stoner Witch. But stop after this. Yes, do not venture deeper into the 90s yet, because this leads into their most experimental period, and I'd save that for the end, all right? Save that for the end. In fact, this is what I would do next. After you got Houdini and Stoner Witch, I'd then go back. Yes, we'd go back to the very beginning in the 90s and go with what is actually my favorite Melvins album. This is my favorite Melvins album, 1991's Bullhead. Man, is this album fucking badass. Now, I would say if you're into underground music already, then you can listen to like some Sonic Youth or Black Flag. If you like early thrash, if you like early Slayer, or you like stuff like Venom, if you like that kind of stuff, then you could probably go right to this album. This could be the first album you'd listen to. But if you're more into melodic metal and classic rock and more traditional heavy metal, then get those other albums that I recommended first. Get those 5 albums first, and then hit Bullhead. Now, if you listen to Bullhead and you're like, yeah, I'm digging it, well, I'll tell you what to do next. But man, Bullhead is great. The first song is this long song. It's got a groove. In this album, it just has this great guitar tone. You hear it from the beginning, this fuzzy, badass guitar tone. It's kind of similar to like Black Sabbath's Master of Reality, where that tone just hits you and it never lets up. that whole album has that tone, and this album's like that. Like once you hear that tone, if you like that tone, you're gonna love this album because the whole album sounds like that. It's this great trippy kind of stoner metal drone song, Boris. Boris is a masterpiece. And then afterwards, it's all these kind of shorter, snappier, I would say heavy metal songs. This is, heavy metal. It's just street gritty heavy metal with a punk attitude. But I think Buzz's stuff leans more towards heavy metal than punk. There's definitely a punk influence. And there's a punk aesthetic, especially in terms of the lyrics and the album artwork, with a few exceptions here and there. Their album artwork is a big thing that I think puts off maybe headbangers because it has more of that ironic punk rock thing going on, more like Black Flag album covers or a lot of the album covers in the 90s and Nirvana and stuff like that, or Mudhoney. It has that kind of comic book style, kind of ironic album art. But the music's like pure fucking Sabbath worship and Priest worship and early Kiss worship, just all mixed together with a little Black Flag to create like just something fresh and new. Just like the new wave of British heavy metal was mixing traditional heavy metal elements with punk to create something new. And what Buzz did was he slowed it down. Where everyone was making it faster, he did that. He slowed it back down to that Sabbath stomp. And in doing so, created grunge years before anyone else was doing it. Years before anyone even had a word for it. And that's what he was doing in the underground. And Bullhead is a masterpiece, my favorite album of theirs. Now, let's say you like the other albums, but Bullhead was just a little too raw for you, was just a little too heavy and raw and underground for you. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. But if it does, then you know what? Stop here. Don't get their earlier stuff. And jump back to the albums that follow The Bride Scream Murder. And then you're pretty safe afterwards, for the most part. The Bulls and Bees is a great EP. It's the last recording they did with the Big Business lineup, which has some really great stuff on it. And then I'd steer away from a few albums after that. But it's Bases Loaded. Yeah, 2016's Bases Loaded is really where you should go after Bullhead if Bullhead was not accessible enough for you. All right, Bases Loaded is a really accessible, I would say, stoner doom metal album with hints of psychedelia. In fact, if you're a big doom metal guy, maybe go to this album first, because this is probably their doomiest album. You can even tell by the album cover, which is badass. It's just a really great, I'd say, psychedelic stoner doom metal album. It has a few little offbeat, quirky songs, but for the most part, just straight ahead, sludgy, dark, trippy metal music with great hooks and great melodies. This is my favorite album of theirs post the Big Business era albums. And that's great. So Bases Loaded, you should definitely get. And also, I think Pincus Abortion Technician. It's a very catchy album. Very fun. This kind of mixes a little more of the punk and alternative rock side, but there are a few metal moments, and it's just catchy and fun. Great cover of the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand. Very rockin' and fun. There's a lot of sense of humor in the Melvins, too. That's the thing. They're not like a full-fledged joke band. Maybe not as much as, let's say, like a band like Ween or even Frank Zappa at times, but they have a little bit of that kind of sense of humor, and it emerges here and there. Also, the Butthole Surfers, who actually, it's the bassist from that band is actually playing with them during this period. They have a little of that quality too. So it emerges here and there. But one great thing about the Melvins is the humor never overrides things. Like they have a sense of humor. It's funny. They break things up with some silly songs here and there, but they know how to balance it out. They don't overdo it, which is great. And their latest album, 2021's Working with God, great album. Starts off right away with a jokey, fun version of the Beach Boys, I Fuck Around. And they actually perform it really well. Buzz does a fairly decent Brian Wilson impersonation, but it's just a funny song. But then the rest of the album is just straight up great, catchy, heavy metal music from the Melvins. And it's a really great album. And I really like that. That's strong. I would say Bases Loaded's a little stronger, and those albums they did with the Big Business guys. But after that, Working with God is one of my favorite later releases. And then I think for the most part, if Bullhead was too much for you, you could kind of stop there. And that's already you already got a whole bunch of Melvins albums. Now, let's say you did like Bullhead, all right? Let's say you liked Bullhead. You're going to like all those other later albums. So yeah, get those later albums. But you can likewise go backwards because you're cool and you love Bullhead. You could get their first two albums then, because that's the two albums before it. Gluey Porch Treatments from 1987 and 1989's Ozma. Ozma is especially badass. I love Ozma. I have a vinyl version of Ozma that came also with Bullhead. I got both of those, and they're amazing. And this stuff, it's not as melodic and catchy as Bullhead, but if you like just straight up heavy, it's got a groove though. There are hooks, but it's like heavy hooks. But if you like shit like Venom and early Slayer and some heavier Motorhead and Black Flag, like My War and Slip It In period, where they were mixing heavy metal, mixing it with the punk crossover shit. If you like crossover punk heavy metal shit, you should love this. These two albums are definitely albums to pick up if you're into Bullhead. And a lot of editions, I got this edition that actually has two albums together. And so that's good. You got a lot of songs, a lot of bang for your buck. Because in those days, their songs were very short. That was like the punk influence thing. Even though they had a sludgy kind of Sabbathy quality to them, they were short. They were really short. That was kind of like the punk rock aesthetic there, that the songs were short. And definitely if you can get the 2-for-1 of Gluey Porch Treatments and Ozma, that'd be great. And then jump a little ahead of Bullhead, get the following album, Lysol. Although they got sued by Lysol and had to call it just the Melvins. It's just a self-titled album. Now this thing, the only thing that kind of bothers me about this album is it's all one track. Like Prince's Love Sexy, it's all one track. The song, it's great. It's really catchy songs. Not quite as catchy as Bullhead in my opinion, but still great hooks, very Sabbathy. They do a great cover of Alice Cooper's The Ballad of Dwight Fry, one of my favorite Alice Cooper songs, and that's another influence. Actually, you can hear a lot of Alice Cooper band influence in the Melvins. And when I saw them live last, they did an amazing cover of Halo of Flies, and that's, hey, if you love Halo of Flies and you love like Killer and all those wonderful early Alice Cooper albums, there's no reason not to like the Melvins. It's one of their major influences. And combine that heaviness with trippiness, like heavy kind of psychedelia, heavy metal kind of psychedelia. And that's all over the Melvins' work. But yeah, Lysol's a great album. I do wish the tracks were separated. But if you're prepared to sit and listen to this whole long, awesome, fuzzy, badass song, then Lysol's a cool album to get. And then I jump the late 90s. Do not listen to the late 90s. Save that for last. For everyone, no matter what kind of music you like, save that for last. Unless you're really into experimental music. But if you're into experimental music, you're probably not even watching this video. You're too hip to be watching videos on YouTube. All right. So then I jump to another one of my favorite Melvins albums, and that is 1999's The Maggot. Okay, so we are in the late 90s, but the very late 90s, so it's safe. We're on the cusp of the new century. The Maggot is probably their heaviest album they ever recorded. It's the beginning of a trilogy, and I will talk about the trilogy because that's what we're hitting now. The Maggot is definitely the first one you should get from the trilogy, and it is the first one in the trilogy, so it's the proper order. It is just heavy. Great cover of the Green Maharishi, which kind of evokes both the Judas Priest version, but in terms of its sonic power, but it's slowed down like the original Peter Green Fleetwood Mac version. But it's a little like the two combined. It's a great cover. And this whole album's great, especially if you love really heavy shit. This is as heavy as the fucking Melvins ever will be. Ever were before or after. It's a great album. I love it. Then you got the second part of the trilogy is The Bootlicker. Now, this is more like if you're into indie rock and stuff. This is a little different. It's all kind of clean guitar tones. There's no distortion on it. So it's very different for the Melvins. It's all clean guitar tones, but the songs are all really cool and it's very atmospheric. So I would say if you like indie rock or like psychedelic rock or like Pink Floyd and stuff like that, you actually might really enjoy The Bootlicker. I do. I think it's great, and it's a cool, really cool second part of the trilogy. The third part of the trilogy is The Crybaby. Now, The Crybaby, that will be the hardest part of the trilogy to get into. It's the most experimental, but by this point, I think you might be starting to open your mind up to more experimental stuff. And there's some cool heavy shit on it too. It's not all experimental. And they do 2 country songs, and it essentially has a lot of guest stars on it, and it's eclectic. So I would say The Maggot, the first part of the trilogy, is heavy. The second one, The Bootlicker, is kind of trippy and melodic. And then the third one, The Crybaby, is gonzo and eclectic. That's kind of like a Melvins album, but just spread out over 3 albums and with a focus on different sides of the Melvins for each record. But anyway, great stuff. Pretty much after this, you just got fill in the blanks. I would say I also really like the album Hostile Ambient Takeover, but definitely not one of the earlier albums you should listen to. It's a little bit like a better, more accessible Crybaby. It's very eclectic. You got the different sides in the Melvins, the heavy side, but also some of the funkier, more experimental sides. That's really good. I'd say another later album of theirs from 2012, Freak Puke. It's a very eclectic album that shows their different sides. Has some really catchy songs, some heavy songs, some weirder stuff, all stewed together. Great cover of one of my favorite Paul McCartney songs, Let Me Roll It. Does a great cover of that. I'd say the weakest album of their later period is an album called Hold It In, but it's all right. But that's one of the last ones you should get. It's similar to this one album that I've been trying to steer you away from, but now let's talk about it. Okay, after you got all this other stuff, you can give 1996 Stag a try. I only recently started to get into this album. It took me years to get into it, but I've grown to like it. It has a few heavy moments here and there, and it's not full-fledged experimental. There are little songs, and some songs are actually very melodic, but more done in an indie rock style. I say it's a little like the Bootlicker, but I don't like it as much as the Bootlicker. I don't think the songs are as strong. And it's a little try-hard. You can hear like he's trying to be offbeat on this album, a little more so than the other albums where he just sounds genuinely and organically offbeat at times. Whereas this album, it's a little try-hard in my opinion. But I have grown to like it and appreciate it. And if by this point, if you listen to all these Melvins albums, you're going to be open to hearing something that's a little different from them. And I mean, there's even like one song that has like a trumpet playing, and it's just a little different. But if you like psychedelic rock, if you're open-minded to things that are a little bit different, or like Frank Zappa and stuff like that, or like very early Alice Cooper, like the first two Alice Cooper albums, if you're open-minded to that, then you could probably get into Stag. But it's definitely one of the last albums of theirs to get. They did two full-fledged experimental albums. One was in 1994 called Prick, although they released it with their name backwards. I guess that would be their worst album, but even that has a few cool things if you're open-minded to it. Although it's out of print and very expensive. So, I mean, I don't have a copy of that. Or the next one, Honky from 1997, their follow-up to Stag. And Honky is their most experimental album, probably after Prick. But it is more enjoyable. I find this album has more of a kind of psychedelic ambient groove to it. And I actually like it. Actually, I like it better than Stag. But this album, unfortunately, is also out of print, and I don't have a copy of it. But I've listened to it a few times on YouTube, and I do like it. I'm going to try to track myself down a copy of it in the coming weeks, if I can, because I do like it. And there's the Eggnog EP, which is actually, I think, their best EP. Actually, I think it's their second best EP after the Bulls and the Bees EP from 2012. Which that EP, they included Electro Retard, which was kind of a alright experimental eclectic album that had some fun punk songs and some metal songs. A great cover of Pink Floyd's Interstellar Overdrive. It's a good album. I separated the two because they should be apart because they're many years apart and they really have nothing to do with each other. Plus, one of the best things about Electro Retard is that awesome album cover. And then they also did their solo album EPs in the very early 90s, which was a tribute to the Kiss solo albums. The King Buzzo one has like one catchy song on it, and the rest is kind of just noisy, experimental metal, and he did Dave Grohl. It's all right. It's not great. Dale's solo one was actually better. It was just good garage metal. And then they had the bassist, who was just like the bassist for like, I don't know, like a few weeks. he got one too. And it was just a kind of jerk off experimental thing. Avoid that. I guess if you count that, that's the worst thing the Melvins ever did. But come on. Come on. The guy's not, he was like their bassist for what, like less than a year? He just happened to be the guy that was there during the time they did their solo EPs. But yeah, so that's pretty much it for the Melvins. So to think of all the things I said, I would follow the order, my suggestions of how to explore the Melvins discography. And if certain albums, things I said about those albums piqued your interest and you think, yeah, that sounds like something I'd be into, then get those albums, man. The Melvins are one of the greatest bands ever. They're an American institution. God damn it. And if you're not hip to it, you need to become hip to it. One of the greatest bands out there. I love this band. and my love and respect for them has only grown over the years. The first album I listened to was Bullhead, which is my favorite album, and I got into Bullhead because of Mark Prindle, who wrote great reviews. I used to love his reviews in the late 2000s. I would sit and read his reviews. They were very funny and very absurdist. And he reviewed a lot of cool shit, a lot of punk and hardcore and heavy metal albums, and a few classic rock albums too. He wasn't like a snob about that shit, which is one of the things I really liked about his reviews. And so a shout out to Mark Prindle. I don't know if he's watching this or not, but he is one of my Facebook friends. And I want to say thank you, because you got me into the Melvins, because you were the one that said if you like punk but you also like heavy metal and hard rock and some classic rock, you might like Bullhead. You made the suggestion that that should be a gateway album to people that were into metal and hard rock, and as a result I went to Amazon and I bought Bullhead, and man, blew me away, and I became a huge Melvins fan from that point on, and before you knew it, I was getting all their shit. And now they're one of my favorite bands, an amazing band live. They kick it. They're a lot of fun live. They really bring it. They're the real deal. They're the real deal, man. They're just out there hustling, putting out records, playing live, and they release like 2 records a year. They're the real deal, man. Just like Overkill, just like Motorhead was back in the day, Melvins, they're totally legit, and you need to check them out. So that's it. Edwin Canestracci, I'm out, and rock on.